Okay, so this table shows our different cell types that we can find in the gastric glands. There's a lot of cell types here, as you can see, but there are just a few of them that I want to focus on for this class. So let's do that, starting with the parietal cells. Okay, so we have these cells called parietal cells, and as you can see, they secrete gastric acid or hydrochloric acid. They also secrete this thing called intrinsic factor. Don't worry too much about that. I really want to focus on the acid here. Okay. So this diagram shows how the parietal cells secrete acid. Don't worry about that for now. We will talk about it in the next slide. First, I want to talk about the significance of the acid secretion, um, the kinds of functions that it carries out, and so on. Okay. So first of all, we secrete 1 to 3 liters of hydrochloric acid into the stomach every day. So that's quite a lot. Um, that acid brings the stomach pH down to 2. So that is a pretty low pH. That acid carries out a few important functions. The main one is to denature proteins, right? So the proteins that we ingest, when they encounter that pH of 2, they denature. That helps us then further break down the proteins, okay? HCl is also going to trigger the release of an enzyme called pepsin, which then digests those proteins that we just denatured, okay? And our HCl also protects from pathogens, right? So we easily ingest pathogens from the outside through our oral cavity. That low pH kills a lot of those pathogens that we ingest. Okay, so now let's take a look at the mechanism of HCl secretion from the parietal cells. To start off, I want to orient you to this figure. So what you're looking at here on the left is the lumen of the stomach. Right here is the epithelial layer of the cell wall of the stomach wall, okay, including our parietal cell, the star of the show for the time being. And then we have our interstitial fluid and our capillary. Okay, so this is the inside of the stomach right here. It's kind of the main thing to take into account. Okay, so let's take a look at how we make HCl to secrete into the stomach lumen. Okay, first step is our carbonic anhydrase reaction. So pretty familiar now. At this point, we're going to take H2O and CO2, convert it to H plus and bicarbonate. Okay. Next, we're going to take the H plus that we got from that reaction and pump that into the lumen of the stomach. Okay. Next, that HCO3 minus, the bicarbonate that we made from our carbonic anhydrase reaction, we are going to pump out of the epithelial cell, out of the parietal cell on the basolateral side, where it then can enter the plasma. And if you remember, that bicarbonate plays a big role in buffering in the plasma. So we need that bicarbonate in the plasma. I also want to point out that this bicarbonate, when it's pumped out in exchange for chloride anion, okay? And then that chloride anion finally just diffuses out through channels. So it diffuses out of the apical membrane into the stomach. So that's how we get our H plus and how we get our Cl minus. Okay, so now let's take a look at some of the other cell types that we have in our gastric glands. The next set of cells that I want to look at are these mucus cells. So we have these mucus surface cells and these mucus neck cells. So I just described to you how we have in the inside of our stomach a pH of 2 that is very acidic. And that poses a potential problem for the epithelial cells of the stomach, right? So the epithelial cells of the stomach could easily be damaged by that low pH that we have in our stomach acid. So how do we prevent that from happening? Um, that's where the mucus cells come in. Okay, so what we have here is we've got the inside of our stomach right here, stomach lumen, and then down here is our epithelial cells. Okay, and we want to protect this layer of cells from this gastric juice that has a pH of 2. Okay, so we have two ways or two things that we do to prevent damage. One is our mucus surface cells are going to create mucus. They're going to secrete mucus, which acts as a physical barrier between the gastric acid and the epithelial layer. Okay, so it's just, physically blocking access of that gastric juice to the epithelial layer. Second thing is that we have these mucus neck cells, which secrete bicarbonate. And as they secrete bicarbonate, that bicarbonate interacts with the acid in the stomach lumen to neutralize it, so that by the time we get to the surface of the epithelium here, our pH is roughly neutral. Okay, so that's how we protect our epithelial cells in our stomach. Okay, last set of gastric gland cell types is basically everything else. So I'm not going to go into great detail about these. Basically, what I want you to know is what is written here in this sentence at the top of the slide. Basically, we have a few cell types that are going to secrete hormones that will regulate gastric acid secretion. And then we have another cell type that secretes digestive enzymes. So just taking a closer look at that, we have our enterochromaffin-like cells, or ECF cells. We have D cells and G cells, and these cell types all secrete hormones, as you can see, that are then going to regulate our HCl secretion. And then finally, we have our chief cells, which secrete pepsin. They actually secrete pepsinogen. I'll talk about that later. It's an inactive form of pepsin that digests proteins, and also gastric lipase that digests fats.